listen, the practice is not going to get paid. If that biller can't figure that out, it slips through the cracks and they can't get a hold of that patient to get it rectified or the payer to get it rectified, all that money is lost.
My guest in this episode is Cindy Braden, who has sold software to eye doctor practices for nearly 2 decades. She's very in tune with eye care businesses and what they need to do to perform better. And as we talk about that today, there's this deep, dark hole in an eye care practice that relates to the collections, the billings that are made to insurance payers, and whether we get that money in the bank in a timely fashion. So the question that I posed to her is, are your accounts receivable something you can manage better? And what are typical numbers, and how do AR levels in most practices get improved upon? So listen in. This is a finance discussion that you really need to pay attention to because these billers are important people in our practices. This is the Think Again podcast. So why does the accounts receivable level in a practice tend to be this kind of dark hole where ODs don't really completely understand this aspect of their eye care business?
Yeah, I think first I'll say, no guilt trips laid on any practice that feels like they don't have it, right? There's not a lot of tools. And I know you know this probably better than most from running a practice and running other businesses. There's a million fires that come up every single day, right? So, I've heard doctors say, listen, sometimes we see the checks coming in. As long as there's money in the account, we chase other things first, which I get. I mean, we all understand that when there's fires going on, sometimes there's some things that you can't address. And then just natively, there's not the practice management systems, which a lot of things come from. There's just not good reporting on it. So from the leadership side, trying to see what's going on, and then even supporting the billers are creating a lot of manual things. They're creating binders, spreadsheets to track stuff. So imagine being leadership trying to take a look at that. It's probably easiest to be like, I assume they got it. Money's coming in. So, until this becomes a bigger fire than maybe some of the other things, they just don't have time to make it a priority. Not everybody. There's a lot of practices doing it well, but most are not.
I'm guilty.
Yeah.
I mean, we were not that great at it. To your point, we trusted somebody. When you think about generating revenue, it was about how can we bring in new patients? How can we make sure our capture rates are up? And we knew that actually putting the revenue in the bank was important, but we let some people in the practice do that. And I'm not saying they weren't good at it, but I definitely didn't know their systems. To your point, they have a lot of internal systems, don't they?
They do. And they carry huge responsibility, right? We always call it the keep the lights on team. If they're not being supported to make sure that the bills can get paid, nobody else can do their business if you're not being a profitable,
Yeah, I did talk to some doctors at a meeting one time, and it was sort of like, "Do you know your AR?" And they kind of came off the cuff with it, and they admitted that they had learned from some advisor that they should look at it, but they also admitted that their biller was involved in doing all of it, and they didn't know all the details. So let's talk about how our accounts receivable can grow despite the best efforts of these very important staff people who are trying to get that money in the door.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I'll give an example. I've talked to in the last year and a half, hundreds of practices, the billing experts in the practice, which a lot of times it'll be the practice administrator that's responsible for the biller, as well as talking to the billers themselves. And I'm kind of the facilitator of helping figure out things. I'm not a coach on how to do stuff. I just listen and I, point people in the directions of classes or point people, into the tools, some of the tools that we have. And I can tell you, when we import aging and we take a look in these various situations, probably aging is anything over 60 days. So I'll give a couple of little metrics for, leaders, practice leaders to kind of keep in mind. An insurance claim should close. Actually, let me give the exact stat on it. Between 16 and 33 days. So typically people call aging anything over 60 days because it's from the date of service. And sometimes things don't get submitted right away. So it should really be closed, or that payment should be received and applied, and then that claim closed within the first 30 days. But sometimes it pushes a little bit into that 60 days. So typically, when people are talking about aging, they're talking about anything over 60 days.
Okay.
You've got a claim and it hasn't been paid in 60 days, it's probably not, it needs to be touched or fixed or looked at, because it's not going to take that long for a payer to get back. Something went wrong in the journey. So when we work with practices and we take a look at aging, the least amount of aging that I've seen was about $20,000 over 60 days,
Okay.
up to $1 million. We've had practices that have over $1 million in that 60 days
In
plus.
over 60?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Now, so here's the thing I want to say. A lot of the time, and I'm going to put a bit of asterisks on this, because I think I understand the excuse, but it also it goes right back to that first question you had of that black hole. A lot of the times the money has been put in the bank, it just hasn't been reconciled with
Okay.
the claims, right?
Okay.
A lot of the time. So people will look at it, and the billers will come in, and like you said, these are hard working people that fill in and do OCTs when somebody's gone. They fill in on the front desk. We can, discuss that later, but they're working super hard, and they'll say a lot. That's not all real money, which I get, but also, you know, as a biller or as leadership, how do you know how much of that is real money? And how do you know how much of that is, stuff that just hasn't been reconciled?
Yeah.
Um, I will also say again, in optometry's defense, there's negative chargebacks with labs. It is a lot harder to reconcile in optometry. I've talked to people that do billing in other healthcare specialties, hospitals. It's a lot harder in optometry than it is in other systems because of the way our labs work. But the point is, they can be doing a great job, and that, typically it's the 120 days plus that just starts looming, and that's typically where we see the 200, 300,000 up to $1 million is in that bucket. And they'll say, I can't worry about that right now. And they're worrying exactly what you said, that 60-day or 90-day bucket is what they're prioritizing. You can't run any metrics at all so that you can pick up anomalies if you've just got a huge chunk of money sitting out at 120 days.
What are the main reasons that something is not in that 16 to 33 day window and it gets to over 60? Is it that the doctor put the wrong diagnosis code on the CPT, or is it that there's like, I mean, I get the whole idea that there's checks that are put in the bank and it hasn't been reconciled, so the reports read wrong. But when the money's really
Yeah.
outstanding at 60 or 90 days, are there trends?
Yeah. So I did a ton of research trying to make sure that I can give good advice on this for other talks that I've done and whatnot. And typically they say up to 30% of your revenue. So again, you're always looking for new revenue streams, which is great because you should be expanding patient care, new technology. But if up to 30% of your current revenue stream is slipping through the cracks, it's probably a bad analogy, but like water in a leaky boat, right? Like you're putting more money in, but even if it's not 30%, what if it's 20% of your revenue that you're not collecting? It's care you've delivered that you should get paid for. Um, so the two main reasons that things wouldn't get paid in that 16 to 33 days window would be rejection, which means, and I don't know, some offices, the biller does the whole process, right? They do the eligibility and the verification, they gather the information from the patient, but most of the times that's not the case. It's, maybe front desk staff, or they have an outsourced person who answers their phones that schedules. So a rejection basically means, I'm sorry, denial would mean that information they got up front is not accurate. They billed the wrong insurer, the doctor put the wrong CPT code. So that's after it gets submitted to the payer. And I think if practices, this is kind of on my list of things you can do to help your biller, make sure the rest of the office knows how important it is to do that right. Because sometimes they get it and they're busy and they're like, well, there's a patient waiting, and they don't realize, listen, the practice is not going to get paid. If that biller can't figure that out, it slips through the cracks and they can't get a hold of that patient to get it rectified, or the payer to get it rectified, all that money is lost. And then the other thing would be, so not the denials. The second thing would be the rejections, which just means, they have to remember every single rule for every single payer. And sometimes they're state specific, right? And maybe they forgot there's one payer that needs a CLIA modifier for dry eye patients, one
Right.
payer.
Right.
So if they don't remember to get that, that actually immediately gets kicked back because it doesn't have everything the claim needs to even get to the payer. So those are the two main things. And they do say denials, which means the insurer didn't have the right information, about 10% get rejected and never reworked.
Mhm.
And then rejections can be up to 40%, but that is really, practice specific. If your whole team does a good job, getting the right information, and then your biller is protected and has that time to review the claims for accuracy before they submit them. But if they don't, good luck, right? It just,
Well, I mean,
yeah,
who cares if it's 10% or 30%? The reality is if denials and rejections are coming through on a regular basis, and a person has to work through every one of those individually, it becomes very difficult for them to keep up because the next day there's another set of
brand
patients
new
who have seen
stuff.
who need their
Yeah,
first time claim submitted,
yeah.
right? So you got
I
that work on top of this work.
I gotta think there's, so many old sayings about fixing things the first time is a lot easier than trying to correct things, downstream. Just the time, the efficiency. What, they say if you're trying to keep an organized house, touch something once. If you bring your mail in, don't put it in a pile and then 2 days later pick up that pile and move it in your office and then 3 days later open the mail. I think billing is the same thing. Touch it once, get it done right and get paid. Otherwise, not only are you decreasing the risk of not getting paid. If somebody's touching it 8 times trying to get it cleaned, think of, the amount of money you're spending on staff
Oh my God.
energy on it. So,
So I
yeah.
was going to ask you, and let's go there to sort of provide our listeners with ideas that maybe they don't have specific tools or processes. They have a biller who they trust. Again, these billers are very important people in our practices. And you already said one thing is in your office meetings, if somebody's collecting eligibilities, particularly on managed vision care, but also on major medical insurance, that we get that right. I mean, that's
Yeah.
great advice.
Yeah.
What else would you recommend? And like, what results should we expect to see? I'm guessing it's less AR, but
Yeah.
give us some more
Yeah.
guidance.
So, protect their time. I was dying. Like 2 months ago, I was talking to a biller, and one of the first things I say is, do you just do billing? Do you have protected time? Because I think it's really important. There's again, everybody in the practice has so many fires. I think optometry practices more than anything are people are wearing multiple hats, right? And everybody says no. I should just do billing, but I do other stuff. And I was talking to a biller, and she's like, "Yep, all I do is billing." I spent about 30 minutes. I said, "Oh, that's unusual. Usually get pulled in a million directions." We got done with the call, and she's like, "I have to tell you something funny. Twice while we were spending time on this call, somebody poked their head in the office and asked me to help with something else." She's like, "I got asked to run photos because our photo person was out. And then I got asked if I could cover the front desk, And so I was laughing because she thought she only did billing, but in a 30-minute window, she got asked to do, two other things. So protect their time. We already talked about, make sure the entire team feels empowered to focus on getting the information right, right? Getting it right the first time means it's going to help the biller make sure you get paid the first time and then the AR is decreased. This is kind of a silly one, but when you talk to billers that have been doing this for a long time, if they don't have two monitors, if they talk to another biller and they go, "Oh, I've got one monitor." I was talking to somebody, they're working on little 13-inch Macs. They've got to pull up the payer sites. They're trying to open the billers that have two or three monitors, they will visibly gasp a lot when they hear somebody has one monitor or a little monitor. I mean, monitors are $100, right? So make sure they have the basic hardware tools, and then there's a ton of tools in the industry for checking benefits, for getting them help on managing the AR, for scrubbing. The clearinghouses have scrubbing tools, we have scrubbing tools. There's just a lot of things. So I think scheduling time with your biller and making them comfortable. I'm sure there's a lot of wonderful leaders out there that just by accident, you know have a biller uncomfortable saying, "Hey, I'm not doing a good job with this," right? So just carving out time and giving them the permission to say, "Here's what we're doing well and here's what we're not doing well," so that you can find the right tools to support them.
That makes a ton of sense. And
Yeah, it's probably
the because your company does sell software to practices to make the billers better, I know you sell on a very trusting approach. That means, as you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, you talk to these people, and oftentimes you talk to them out of the doctor's earshot. And
Yeah.
so, I don't want to have any secrets, left here that are from known sources, but tell us a little bit about what you hear from billers that they don't tell the practice owners, because while there is trust and these people are doing their work hard, like the OD who sometimes turns a corner a little too quick, sometimes the billers have to just to keep themselves above water. What does that sound like when you have these trusting conversations with them and they're kind of confiding in you?
Yeah. And, I will say it is great because I hear most of the time I hear the doctors say, our biller is crushing it,
Yeah.
which is great. And then when you talk to the biller, they say, well, they say, I love to hear that because I'm working hard. And the doctors can see it, right? And very often the billers are meeting with the doctors at least once or twice a month, and they're at least having the conversations. But the billers are not sharing, they're just not comfortable sharing the areas that they're missing things. I had somebody say and this biller was working incredibly hard covering, I don't want to say how many because this biller is kind of a super biller and she covers more than the average biller. And then another practice hears it and they go, well, how many doctors is that biller billing for? Right? Like everybody has their bandwidth. But I was talking to this biller and she was like, I'm driving home and I'm like, oh, I totally missed that modifier for the Humana. She's like, and I got it submitted and now I know it's going to get rejected. And, I'm going to get in the office tomorrow and I'm going to write on a Post-it note to look out for that one when it comes back, because after I walked out of the office, I noticed I was missing it. Right. So, I guess I would say, the number one thing would be billers don't want to have to confess all the times the stuff that's missing and slipping through the cracks, because it would be impossible. You can talk to any expert. All of the alliance groups have billing experts, not just coding, like, the exam coding, but people who know workflow and understand it. And every one of them will say it is impossible to not miss stuff. It's impossible especially with the tools, that people have. But if you put things in place, I brought up, some of those examples, the least amount of AR for a practice that I talked to, the doctor had about 20,000 over 60 days, and was like, it's a solo practice, busy practice, really already doing well. That's a very good amount of AR to have when consider hundreds of thousands or up to $1 million in AR. And was like just not happy with that AR and put a bunch of tools in place. And in about 6 months, got that AR down to 1,500. So if you think about, I mean, it absolutely can be done. And if you think about, like you said, what if it's 30%? What if it's 10% that's in AR that's not getting paid? If you can cut it down like that because you're arming your team, you're supporting your staff to make sure that it's a priority, that's going to be, don't add additional revenue streams if money's leaking out through your aging, because you're just going to be keep adding revenue and more of it's going to get missed. So I personally think it should be a fire. Even if you're like, it's not a noticeable fire, maybe when you hear this, you go, I need to check,
Yeah.
and just see. So
Well, I think the old adage was that your AR should be about 1 month's billables, right?
yes,
So if you're
yes.
doing $150,000 a month in revenue, you shouldn't have a total AR of over $150,000. And I would always ask the question when I've heard this, why? Why does it have to be that much? And to your point, 16 to 33 days means that a lot of the stuff that doesn't get filed in a timely fashion, stuff that needs a lot of accessory information on it to be billed right the first time. It takes a while to put it in. It takes a while for it to process. But between denials and rejections and mistakes we make, what happens is sometimes this stuff gets rolled not because the biller is feeling like they can't do any more, but it ends up getting rolled into write-offs.
Yeah, yeah. They
And
they just lose track of it. Yeah.
yeah,
And
they just lose.
again, like if you think of it, I think it's actually, hold on. Like I'll just imagine having to track this, right? Aetna, you have 120 days from the date of service to get paid. Humana, you have 90 days. Medicare, you have 12 months. So, imagine something gets rejected or denied. You have a list of 100 or 1,000, depending on the size of the practice. Do you start at the oldest? Well, what if you start at the oldest and, like you said, new claims come in every day because the doctor's seeing patients, and then you miss in the middle a whole bucket of claims that expire in 3 months. That, so the biller's trying to keep track of this. They're working hard. I really feel like the deck is stacked against them in a lot of this, and everybody wants to practice to get paid. They love to tell stories of wins. They have, money they found. They find credentialing issues where it's a small payer, and then they notice for 6 months they weren't getting paid, and then they get it fixed, and then this big money comes. They get so excited. They take very, very personal responsibility for making sure the practice gets paid. So it's fun helping them out and getting them, the support that they need.
Well, I'm glad a company like yours gives these folks the oxygen to breathe, be successful. And I hope that the audience understands after listening to you and giving some of
I
these
hope
data
so.
that they need to start digging in this part of the practice, even if they don't think they have an issue and if everything's going great. Any last words?
Yeah, I guess the last one I would say, I've heard a couple of people, and I get it. I'll get a practice administrator call. A lot of times it's the spouse of the doctor, and they'll say, "Hey, doctor just came back from a meeting," and they're like, "What's our AR look like?" Because somebody talks about it, and it's a short-term fire. So, they'll ask me questions. So I guess I would say that's great. Again, I know other things come up, but try to like have a temporary fire and then put a plan in place so that you know what it is. If you know what you're expected to collect, your biller is on top of it, you're aging, you are able to recognize when something like a credentialing issue comes up, because you know exactly how much money you're supposed to be getting in, and you just don't have surprises. And when you add new revenue streams, you're collecting 95% of what you expect to collect, which is where you should be. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Cindy Braden, thank you for being my guest on today's Think Again
Thanks,
podcast.
Scott.
Hey, that's it for today's Think Again podcast, brought to you by GPN Visions, a peer-to-peer learning community to help grow your eye care business.